If an aspirant truly engages himself in the practice of self-attention, he will often feel as if the state of self-consciousness, which is his own true nature, is clearly known for some time, and as if it is afterwards obscured. On such occasions he will be able to understand very clearly, from his own experience, how the world appearance vanishes, and how it again comes into existence. Because of the speed of forgetfulness or pramada by which he swerves from the state of self-attention, it may be difficult in the beginning for an aspirant to notice exactly when he loses his hold on self-attention. In due course, however, because of the clarity and strength which he will gain by repeatedly practicing self-attention, it will become possible for him to notice the exact moment when self-attention is lost, and thus it will become possible for him to regain it immediately. On all the occasions when he thus clearly cognizes the moment when self-attention is lost and the moment when it is regained, the aspirant will be able to know very easily from his own experience how the world is created by his losing self-attention, and how it is then destroyed by his regaining self-attention. Thus the aspirant will come to know with absolute certainty that his giving room to slackness in self-attention is the means by which the body and the world are created, that his maintaining slackness in self-attention on account of his lack of interest either to notice that such slackness has occurred or to put an end to it, is the means by which the world is sustained, and that is firmly abiding once again in his own real and blissful state of pure consciousness, which is devoid of the limitations of name and form, having vigilantly known the exact moment when slackness in self-attention occurred, and having thereby put an end to it, is the means by which the world is destroyed. When the aspirant comes to know this truth from his own direct experience, he will realize himself to be the perfect supreme reality which transcends the three functions of creation, sustenance, and destruction, and hence he will remain unshakably established in the state of absolute peace. A person will feel no liking to take the practice of self-attention until he gains the proper discrimination, whereby he can understand that the two states of creation and sustenance, which are merely a mixture of pleasure and pain, are not worthy to be cherished and pursued. So long as he continues to give importance to these two states, which are nothing but mere appearances, he will be liable to build castles in the air by imagining that he can eliminate pain from this mixture of pleasure and pain, which is one of the many dyads, and that he can thereby make pleasure alone prevail in two states of creation and sustenance. Though such a person may be very broad-minded, generous-hearted, and compassionate, since he may even be deluded to the extent of believing that the miseries which we now see in the world would not have existed if the functions of creations and sustenance had been performed in accordance with his own visionary ideas, and thus he will find fault even with God, who is now performing those functions, and he will wistfully imagine that he must take responsibility for carrying out a reform in the present matter in which God is governing the world. He will then proceed to draw up wonderful plans, whereby he hopes to transform this world into a blissful heaven and remove all the miseries seen in it, even hoping to make the body of man immortal. Such a well-intentioned but deluded person will then begin to ponder how and from where he can acquire the divine power or Shakti, which is necessary in order for him to carry out this wonderful, unselfish plan of his, and he will begin to devise and practice many new kinds of yoga in the hopes of achieving such power. Finally, however, he will have to come to the conclusion that he can obtain such power only from God, the Almighty Supreme Lord, who is at present creating and sustaining this whole world. And so he will then select the method of complete self-surrender as a means of begging and acquiring such power from him. Being confident that the unlimited power of God will surely be showered upon him if he adopts this method, and believing that with that power he can fulfill all the wonderful plans which he has drawn up, he will be waiting in eager expectation for the day that power will descend from above. Knowing that there were people who were actually so deluded as to imagine, like the man described above, that it was both necessary and possible for them to bring about a radical reformation in the manner in which the world has been created and was being governed by God, Sri Bhagavan composed the following 2 verses. The buffoonery of the madmen, who, not knowing the manner in which they function by Shakti, that is, not knowing the truth that it is only by the Atma Shakti or power of self that they are enabled to function and perform activities, engage in activities saying, "We shall obtain all occult powers, siddhis," is like the story of the cripple who said, "If someone helps me to stand, what are these enemies? That is, how powerless they will be in front of me." See, when God is bearing the burden of the world, the pseudo-soul, imagining as if it were bearing that burden, is a mockery, like the form of a Gopuram Tangi, a sculptured figure which seems to support the top of a temple tower with great strain, but which in fact is itself supported by the tower. Whose fault is it if someone who is traveling in a train, which is bearing a great burden, undergoes suffering by bearing his small burden on his own head, instead of placing it on the train? Uladu Narpadu, Anubandham, verse 15 and 17. But if the man described above really takes to the path of complete self-surrender in order to acquire from God the power which is necessary for him to bring about such a radical reformation in the creation, what will actually happen in the end? If and when the surrender becomes complete, the mind or ego which has risen as "I am so-and-so," and which had cherished all the wonderful notions mentioned above, will surely drown and perish in self, the source from which it had risen, thereby losing its separate individuality. Until and unless the ego is thus annihilated, the surrender cannot be said to be complete. Since a person therefore cannot remain as a separate individual entity after he has completely surrendered himself to God, upon whom is the divine power to descend, and who is to make use of that power to reform the world. Thus, in the end, all the hopes and ambitions cherished by this poor man will turn out to be completely meaningless and absurd, just like the patently fictitious story told in Kaivalya Navitam, chapter 2, verse 89. The son of a barren woman and the man seen superimposed on a post, wearing wreaths of flowers imagined in the sky, haggled about the price of the silver in the mother of pearl, began to fight in the city shining in the clouds, stabbed each other with the horns of a hare, became exhausted and died, after which they both became ghosts. On hearing such a story, no wise man will be deceived. Why should any man unnecessarily tax his brain and confuse himself by cherishing such ideas and ambitions? When Sri Bhagavan was once asked about the beliefs of a certain philosopher who cherished the strange notions mentioned above, he briefly replied, "Let the surrender first become complete. We can see about everything else afterwards." Why did he reply in this way? Transforming this world into a heaven devoid of misery and making man immortal are not things which have to be newly done. Even now the world is truly nothing other than Brahman, the blissful supreme reality. And man is, in his true nature, nothing other than self, the immortal spirit. Therefore the world and man do not now need to be made either blissful or immortal. All that we need to do is to see them as they really are. That is why sages say, making one's outlook of the nature of knowledge, one should see the world as Brahman. The defects which we now see in the world and in man are not defects in God's creation, but are only defects in our own outlook. Therefore it is no use in trying to rectify God's creation by usurping his power. If we wish to rectify all the defects which we see, we must rectify our own outlook. There is no other way. Those who know the reality will declare that there is no defect in creation, Srishti, but that there is a defect only in outlook, Drishti. Sri Ramana Jnana Bodham, Volume 1, verse 1696. Whatever has appeared is bound to disappear. Whatever has been created is bound to be destroyed. Whatever has been born will have to die, and whatever has come will have to go. Whatever has been newly known by the mind at one time will have to be forgotten by it at a later time. But that which always exists without appearing or disappearing, without being coming or going, and without becoming knowing or being forgotten, alone is the eternal reality. That alone is our true nature. We were never born, only our body was born. Having come into existence, our body will come one day to lose its existence, either by dying or by disappearing. We cannot make it live forever. If we so desire, we may be able to develop our own wonderful innate power and thereby forcibly extend the lifetime to this insentient body for a short while. The ancient sage Tirumular lived for 3,000 years, composing the 3,000 verses of Tirumantira at the rate of one per year. But at the end of those 3,000 years, what happened to his divine body? It disappeared, did it not? Therefore no one can make the body retain its form for all eternity. Moreover, there is no need for anyone to do so. When even great sages who have attained true knowledge have never made the body immortal, if anyone else tries to do so, it will be a futile effort, like paving a road to a town which does not exist. In this context, some people ask, the bodies of some sages, such as Tirugina Sambandhar and Manikavachakar, did not perish and were not left behind in this world as corpses. Does this mean that they had made their bodies immortal? The answer to this question is as follows. What happens to the body of an ordinary person when it is left behind as a corpse? It loses its form by being decomposed into the 5 elements of which it was originally composed. That is, the body is left in one of the elements, either in fire, in the earth, in water, or in the open air, and that one element gradually separates the other elements in the body, thereby merging them into the surrounding elements. Thus, the form of the body gradually disappears. In the case of a few people, however, instead of taking place gradually, this process of separating the elements in the body happens by the power of divine grace in a split second. But what difference is there in the final result? None at all. Even the bodies of those sages have lost their form and have disappeared, have they not? A difference can be seen only in the manner in which the separation of the elements in the body took place and in the time taken for it to happen. But all the same, the forms of their bodies were not retained unperished. Since the body anyway has to lose its form and disappear, what does it matter how it loses it? Even if the body loses its form and disappears instantaneously, as happened in the case of those sages, it cannot be said that it has been made immortal. Since the bodies of those sages were born and newly appeared in the world at one time, they had to die and disappear from the world at a later time. On hearing this answer, some people raise a further objection by saying, but there is also a belief which maintains that even though their gross bodies disappear, the sages live eternally in their subtle bodies governing the affairs of the world. Therefore, do not their bodies continue to exist at least in that subtle form? Is not that state to be considered as immortality of the body? The answer to this is as follows. Is it that it is possible only in the case of great ones to have subtle bodies and carry on the activities of the world? Even ordinary people, after giving up their gross body, are able to take subtle bodies according to the result of their virtuous or sinful actions and carry on the activities of their respective world. God, too, one of the three entities, is in the same way engaged in his activities of creation, sustenance, and dissolution. Do we not also concede the fact that such a thing takes place upon the plane of duality? What is there to be wondered at? It is for this reason only that even the forms, entities of God, are said to be devoid of truth from the standpoint of the absolute reality. Be they gross, subtle, or causal, they are, after all, a body only. So long as one identifies oneself with any one of these three bodies as I, it is only ignorance. Certainly there cannot be but an end to that body and to the ignorance, the identification with it. We, the absolute truth, are not a body, not even any one of the above three kinds. We should realize that the body is born only to die. The discrimination leading to such conclusion alone is the right discrimination. Before the birth of their body, what and how were they who now want to prolong their body or immortalize it? Before they were born, why were they not worrying about this body which they now seek to prolong and preserve? Before they were born, they were without the present body, but they did not feel it as a loss. Even after the death of the present body, they are, of course, going to be without the present body. As such, what loss anew will they have, and why should they worry for it now? Does it not therefore stand to reason that it is the lack of the perfect knowledge of the self, i.e., what they really are, which accounts for all their above efforts? Therefore, let all their efforts be channeled into the direction of rightly knowing the self. Moreover, the body itself is a disease for us who are ever deathless, blemishless, and diseaseless. During the last days of his illness, Sri Bhagavan Ramana once said to his devotees, who were extremely worried about the condition of his body, "The body itself is a disease. If that disease gets a disease, is it not for our own good? Only frivolous people with the venomous ego, whose poison is the cause of all diseases of misery, perform ceaseless austerities, tapas, to strengthen and lengthen the lifespan of the body, like one who takes medicine to prolong the disease." Guru Vachaka Kovai, verse 233. If we realize, from what has been said above, the fact that the real cause of all the miseries that appear to us in the world is solely due to our defective outlook that has come into existence as a result of our contracting our limitless, blissful nature of existence into a limited body through the unlimited freedom inherent in us of using our will, it will then become obvious that the only wise thing to do is to put an end to the disease of the appearance of the world and body through self-attention, and be ever blissful. Therefore, yogic efforts of mankind to immortalize the body and heavenize the world are vain and in no way better than the activities of a blind man in a dark room who is doing something without even knowing what he is doing. The root cause of all these activities, such as to usurp the power of the Almighty to carry out the aforesaid ambitions, is the wrong discrimination, or the ignorance through which one feels that the two entities, world and God, are different from the self. This in turn is due to the lack of right knowledge of the self, i.e., the lack of knowing oneself to be the indivisible whole, the supreme reality transcending the trinity of world, God, and soul. Therefore, first and foremost, let the human effort be directed towards rightly knowing the self, before hastily concluding anything about world and God. Then the truth of world and God will dawn of its own accord. It is but natural for some to ask, should we not then be compassionate towards all beings suffering around us? Should we not then engage ourselves in the service of mankind and eradicate those miseries? Is not there a path of karma yoga, well charted and followed? Yes, it is a very great principle to mind others' welfare. But is it not first necessary to know what is good for us, before knowing what is good for others? It is no wonder, when man does not know what he really is, that he is not able to know what is good for him. Unless he knows this, how can he understand what are others and what is good for them? Man, who through a limited outlook believes himself to be a body, can know others also to be bodies only. The same wrong outlook makes him decide wrongly what is good for him and for others. Besides, he is at his wit's end to know correctly even what is good and what is bad, when along with the previous ignorance of not knowing what he really is and what others are, the ignorance of not knowing what is good and what is bad is added, both play havoc to lead and all his activities in great confusion. What is good and what is bad? Today, through some kind of discrimination, we decide as a bad thing that yesterday we decided as good. In the same way, tomorrow, through some other kind of discrimination, we may decide as a bad thing that today we decide as good and give it up. Our standards of good and bad often change according to the whims and fancies of our likes and dislikes. What is to be inferred from this? Only that we do not have an infallible definition regarding good and bad, which is one among so many dualities. In such a state of confusion, how can we set out to do what is good to the world? What wonder is there if a man suffering from chronic constipation during one of his philanthropic moods gives laxative pills to one and all, including those suffering from chronic dysentery, the philanthropic mood that takes possession of one who sees others as oneself, will only work in this topsy-turvy fashion. To recapitulate what has been said above. 1. Because man does not know what he is, he cannot know what the world is. 2. Because man does not know what is good for himself, he cannot know what is good for others. 3. Because man is incapable of giving himself all help, he surely is incapable of helping the world. It is a matter of common knowledge that on account of these 3 reasons only, all those who came forward as reformers under the mistaken notion of doing good are but to be those who have brought forth so many wrongs and evils to the world. Why to talk about these poor reformers? How can any of them hope to do any permanent good to the world when God Himself accepts the fact that He cannot reform the world once for all? Let us turn to the words of Lord Krishna, who performed so many great miracles from the very moment of His birth. For establishing righteousness, I incarnate myself from age, yuga, to age, yuga. Verse 8 of chapter 4, Bhagavad Gita. From His own saying, we are made to understand that He has to come again and again. Had His reform been permanent, there would have been no need for Him to come again and again. What can we infer from this? That it does not show the inability of the Almighty, but that it only betrays the unreal nature of the world. This very fact was pointed out by Bhagavan Sri Ramana. Therefore, in the name of reform, let not man's ego rise and spoil himself, as well as the world. First, let us control these kinds of emotions and make the mind calm. We have seen in the Path of Sri Ramana, Part 1, page, how on account of our ignorance of what is self, the word selfishness is wrongly used to denote a vice. What is decided as good or bad by a jnani, who alone experiences the whole universe as his own self, will only be the right decision. If at all we have to know what is really good and what is really bad, though, strictly speaking, in his view, there is neither good nor bad, as there is no world at all apart from his self. It is only the body which is very limited that is felt by man as I. Through such restricted feeling, everything that he sees, this world and all its living beings, seem to him to be different from himself. As the body alone is felt to mean I, selfishness is considered to be a vice. But for a jnani, who has the true knowledge of the self, I is experienced as an all-pervading single whole. So from his viewpoint, his selfishness is nothing but the highest altruism. When a jnani thus feels everything as the one undivided self, will not his body also be included in that experience as I? The experience of the ignorant is, I am this body alone, while that of a jnani is, I am the body as well. This is explained by Sri Bhagavan Ramana in verse 17 of Uladu Narpadu. For those who have not realized the self, and as well for those who have realized the self, this body is I. But for those who have not realized the self, the I is confined only to the limit of the body, and for those who have realized the self within the body, i.e., in this very lifetime, the I shines as the limitless self. Know that this is the only difference between these two. In the same manner as the whole universe is experienced by the jnani as not apart from self, existence, consciousness, bliss, Satchitananda, it is not wrong for the jnani to feel that the world is real, but it is certainly wrong if an ignorant says the world is real, so long as his experience of I is limited to the body alone. It is because the ignorant takes the world, the names and forms, the unreal aspects of Brahman, to be real, that he is to be instructed. Brahma alone is real. The world is unreal. Brahman Satyam Jagat Mithya. But really, from the viewpoint of the Supreme, undivided experience of a jnani. The world is existence, consciousness, bliss, Satchitananda, the Brahman. This is explained by Sri Bhagavan Ramana in verse 18 of Uladu Narpadu. The world is real for those who have not realized the self as well as for those who have realized the self. For those who have not realized, the reality is of the measure, i.e., name and form, of the world. For those who have realized, the reality shines as the nameless and formless substratum of the world. Know that this is the only difference between these two. The jnani's selfishness is verily the real and right kind of unselfishness, glorified by the people till now. On the other hand, if others' welfare is decided with whatever amount of generosity coming through the sattvic mood that may rise at times in the poor mind of the jiva, no matter how marvelously brilliant his intellect is, or how well versed he is in all the different branches of learning, whose knowledge is confined to the idea, I am the body, it will end only in the ill fare of the world. From what has been said above, let not the reader think that it is wrong to do good to others. If it is not one's own good that is aimed at, then whatever good that is done for others is good. Out of the many different kinds of disinterested worship, Nishkama Puja, the worship of the universe as the form of God, is also recommended. Viewing the universe as God and worshipping it can only be done through the imaginative process of the mind. So it will be only the worship of a mental God and not that of reality. But to really experience the universe as God, which is really worshipping it, is it possible only after realizing the true nature of the self? For the world and God will not remain as entities other than the self. In the heart, at first you see him who is everywhere. Only then that all exist as him you'll be aware. Dhyana patu sadhanai saram. But by viewing the world and the living beings in it as God, at least by mind, a great good does result, namely the purification of mind. This is the hidden aim of Karma Yoga. Karma Yoga allows a man to discriminate and decide what is good for himself and what is good for others according even to his ordinary mind, and allows him to act accordingly. But it is to be known that the purpose of this allowance is neither the complete eradication of the miseries of the world, nor the capturing of God, the inaccessible one. Sri Bhagavan Ramana gives out the method and the result of Karma Yoga as Upadesha Undiyar, verse 3. Acts performed without attachment to the results and dedicated to the Lord, purify the mind and point the way to liberation. Therefore, the purpose of Karma Yoga is only the purification of the mind. This person, being the hidden aim, is enjoined in Karma Yoga. You have the right only to do, but never the right over the results thereof. Bhagavad Gita, chapter 2, verse 47. Here the word results not only applies to the result of the activities of the aspirant, sadhaka, but also the result of the practice of Karma Yoga. The Karma Yogi who is engaged in the service of humanity with an unselfish motive expects, as a result at least, that those whom he serves will be relieved from their miseries and get happiness. He may think that he is making the sacrifice of any personal benefit when, in fact, it is he only who is really benefited, since such action purifies his mind. If the aspirant in the beginning of his practice does not get at least this expectation that the world will be relieved from its miseries by his service, he will lose all enthusiasm and faith towards Karma Yoga. If enthusiasm and faith are lost, The purification of the mind, which is the aim and result of Karma Yoga, will also be lost. But the purification of the mind and thereby its ability to discriminate rightly grows simultaneously in the aspirant. Therefore, as his mind becomes purer and purer, it gets the high clarity through which his power of understanding becomes sharper and sharper. Now, only with this, he is able to understand the necessity of rightly knowing the self and how the appearance of the world and God is connected with self-knowledge, and also how purification of the mind is the sole aim of Karma Yoga, as it has been explained so far in this chapter. Indeed, what greater benefit than this clarity of mind is worthy to be attained through Karma Yoga? For the aspirant is now really qualified for the science of self, by which the supreme truth will dawn in him. It is this process that is pointed out in verse 3 of Upadesha Undiyar, by Sri Bhagavan referred to previously, how the purification of the mind is affected by the practice of Karma Yoga. If we know what is the impurity in the mind, the way in which it is removed by the practice of Karma Yoga will also be clearly understood. I and mine are the impurities of the mind or chittam. If these impurities which form the tam in chittam are removed, chittam will remain as chit, pure consciousness, which it really ever is. Just like a colorless prism appears to be red when near a red flower, chit consciousness appears to be chittam, the mind, when the impurities I and mine are superimposed on it. When these, which are caused by Maya, are removed, it shines as ever as chit. Guru Vachaka Kovai, verse number 244. I and mine are the root impurities of all other innumerable impurities such as lust, anger, and the like. Even out of these two, the possessive form mine can have an existence only because of I. Where there is no I, there will be no mine. Though in its pure nature I is the self, it is taken to be impure because of its attributes which are alien to it and experienced as I am this, I am this body, I am a man or I am so and so. Hence the attributes appended to I am alone are the root impurity. Till these impurities are removed, self, existence, consciousness, Sat-Chit, is called ego. The true purpose of yoga is only to remove this root impurity. The methods of removing the impurities vary according to the maturity of the aspirants. Consequently, different yogas have to be framed to the aspirants who are very intent on removing their impurities, the impurity in the form of mind being gross rather than the impurity of the form of I, which is subtle, come first within the range of their perception. Then, one with sincere yearning at once starts rejecting everything, saying, "Let it not be for me." This leads to renunciation. Another type of aspirant kindles within himself the feeling of sacrifice, saying, "Let all these of mine be for others and not for me." Karma Yoga is framed having the principle of the second type of aspirant as its base. If wealth, fame, name, and such worldly things make for my happiness, let them all be only for the happiness of others and not for me. With such an attitude, the aspirant engages himself throughout his life in such activities in all the ways he can. Just as a dirty cloth becomes pure and pure as it is beaten and squeezed more and more, so also every unselfish activity of his serves the purpose of dealing a blow upon his mindness, and thereby makes his mind purer and purer. If we minutely scrutinize every injunction and prohibition such as fasting, charitable deeds, and other codes of conduct as enjoined by the Vedas, to be followed by people in their daily actions, nitya karma anusthana, it will become clear that all these aim at making one to sacrifice at least a bit of mindness and put a check on one's craving for the worldly enjoyments. Thus, out of the two impurities, I and mine, as mine is easily noticeable, it is no wonder that all good people with noble aspiration generally first try to tackle only the mineness. For such a mind which is thus purified through the renunciation of mineness, another truth also will dawn. This mine is just like the leaves and branches of a tree. No matter with what effort and how many times they are cut, the leaves and branches, mineness, will under favorable conditions keep on sprouting again and again in some form or other in their own time. Therefore, the root I should be traced out and annihilated. Even for this truth to dawn, is it not necessary that the restless intensity of mineness should be lessened to a very great extent? Until this understanding comes to an earnest seeker through the proper discrimination of the purified mind that I is the right root impurity and that it has to be rooted out, service to humanity, sacrifice for others, and similar unselfish activities in the line of karma yoga will be going on in his life, making up the major part of his endeavor. Then, according to his previous tendencies and tastes, he steps into either the path of devotion, bhakti yoga, or the path of knowledge, jnana yoga, which alone are directly concerned with the annihilation of the ego, the root impurity. He who was all this time being carried along by the current of the tributary Jamuna has now been handed over to the Ganges, the mother river. Here the Jamuna symbolizes the path of karma, karma yoga, while the Ganges symbolizes the path of love, bhakti yoga, and the path of knowledge, jnana yoga. These two are like the Ganges ever flowing into the ocean of Brahman, unfailingly taking along the aspirant who falls into their current. To attain existence consciousness bliss, Satchitananda, the self or Brahman, consciousness Chit, and bliss Ananda themselves act as the two paths, i.e., to reach existence, the supreme Sat, consciousness, Chit, and bliss, Ananda or Priya, are the only paths. The path of consciousness, Chit, is the path of knowledge, Jnana Marga, and the path of bliss, Ananda, is the path of love, Bhakti Marga. To say the truth, Brahman, the Sat itself, stretches its two arms, consciousness Chit and bliss Ananda, to draw us to itself, or in other words, lays itself down under our feet as the path of knowledge and the path of love for us to tread upon. Thus the holy words, I am the path and I am the goal, are proved. The path is to attend to I am, and the goal is to remain as I am. Have we not classified above the effort of the karma yogi, which the aspirant now puts forth to annihilate the root impurity I, into the two main paths, the path of knowledge, Jnana Marga, and the path of love, Bhakti Marga? The method of inquiring, what is this feeling of I? In other words, who am I? Is the true path of knowledge, Jnana Marga, which has been already explained in detail in Part 1, the path of Sri Ramana. Now let us see how the annihilation of the ego, I, the root impurity, is effected through the path of love.